In this lecture, we'll take up the topic, how did the sage disciple? How did the wise person of Israel go about the business of shaping lives? Here are some of the topics that we'll be looking at. What was it that really motivated the sage? What fueled the sage's activities? And then when it comes to the audience, what sort of students did the sage typically enroll? And we're using that term figuratively. Once the students were in place, the audience was in place, what then formed the primary content of the sage's teaching? Incidentally, routinely we refer to the sage in the masculine. There were periodic occasions when a woman emerged on the scene as a wise person. One of these was the wise woman of Tekoa. It's not enough to simply present content. You need somehow to make that content appealing so that your audience will decide to move in that direction. So then, how did the sage motivate? What was the sage's prime illustration? Teaching is fine as bare content, but it's a good idea to have an illustration to make the abstract concepts more easily grasped. How did the sage go about that? First then, what was it that fueled the sage's activities? And these insights will, throughout this lecture, primarily arise from the book of Proverbs. We're acknowledging that Job and Ecclesiastes also are wisdom books, but these topics are viewed primarily through the lens of the book of Proverbs. As we study the sorts of encouragements, commands, and observations that the sage collects in the book of Proverbs, and then ask what seems to motivate the sage to pull these teachings together, this is a conclusion that we may easily arrive at. It is a concern to safeguard a particular group of people, and these are the naive, to safeguard these from unwise choices, which would lead to disastrous consequences. The sage cares enough about these individuals, and that is critical. The sage cares enough about these individuals that he does not want them to wind up in disastrous conclusions, but rather to prosper, to do well. Concentrate on this term, the naive. The Hebrew for this is peti, or plural petiyim. The naive by themselves are not bad people. They are rather like wet clay. They will take the imprint, the moral imprint of whoever can get their hands on them. The sage is rushing to get his hands on the naive before the wicked and other foolish ones get close enough to make an imprint. And he wants to teach them to make wise choices. Opportunities will present themselves. You need to be wise because sometimes the surface view, the face value of a choice confronting you may not really reveal what will be of ultimate worthwhile, what will be ultimately worthwhile. As we continue to talk about what kind of students the sage enrolled, these naive ones typically are young in age. Once again, naive or simple, and the references you see here, chapter 1, verse 4, are coming from Proverbs. Sometimes the naive are translated as simple. Simple in the fact that they have not yet been trained. If the naive do not heed the good advice of the sage, they will fall prey to those who seek to take advantage of them. In addition to the youth or the naive, we find that the sage also speaks to the wise. And a beautiful trait of the wise, as the sage portrays them, is that they never stop learning. They never reach a point where they feel they know everything. They are, in the best sense of the word, lifelong learners. Another trait of those that the sage envisions as those receiving the teaching, the students, these are listeners. These are listeners, persons who are open to teaching. These are receptive. They're malleable. They're attentive. In contrast, the kind of students which the sage is not going to be able to help are described by terms like évil, facile, and naval. And these are various classes of fools. Évil is the basic term for a fool. Facile we might render as stupid. Naval is someone who is so set in their foolish ways that it would take an incredible amount of effort to dislodge them and move them into a wise course of thinking. The scoffers, or sometimes translated mockers, the word is pronounced lates. These are very unlikely candidates for being receptive to the teaching of the sage, because by their very nature, they're obdurate, they are impervious, they are not open to the sage's teaching. In fact, they make fun of those ways that the sage advocates. Ba'ar is another term we find in the book of Proverbs describing the non-receptive, and here more routinely it is translated stupid. Perhaps it's worth acknowledging that stupid here is not classifying someone's intelligence quotient, but rather it's by virtue of the fact that they are uninterested in the way of wisdom. The next group would certainly not have been candidates for enrolling in the sage's instruction, but more clearly, these are people whom a wise person would simply steer a wide path in order to avoid them. People who are actively engaged in activities that are contrary to what the Israelite would know as God's will, and people who are violent, who are embracing patterns of life that do damage to others. Not only are these not good students, these are clearly to be avoided by anyone who wants to take a wise path. The adulteress is another one to avoid, and the figure, the imagery of the adulteress operates on multiple levels. Certainly there is the literal, but there is also the figurative, and on the figurative level, the adulteress is any source of persuasion that seeks to suck someone away from a path of rectitude and moral behavior. A third category that the sage says avoid these people given to angry outbursts, people who are primarily stirred by the emotion of anger. Now let's turn to the topic, what was the content of the sage's teaching? I'm going to offer here a definition of wisdom that attempts to compress a variety of concepts into a brief space. We'll talk about these elements one by one. Wisdom is the observation of order in the material, social, and divine realms, so as to discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. If you're taking notes, you may want to jot that down. We'll be visiting each one of the words listed in caps as we progress. But once again, wisdom is the observation of order in the material, social, and divine realms, so as to discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. First, let's talk about this idea of observation. This was the principal method employed by the sage. You might want to think of the sage as the original scientist, looking for empirical evidence of what works in the world around him, around her. Chapter 7, verse 6 gives a classic example where the sage relates to us this very process of observation. And so you read, "At the window of my house, I looked out through the lattice. I saw among the simple," there's that petit, the naive, "a youth, Na'ar, who lacked judgment," an impressionable youth. The sage made this observation, and as the story of chapter 7 progresses, the sage sees the bad choice that the youth makes and the disastrous consequences and destination at which he finally arrives. It becomes deadly. By observing that, he extracts a principle which then he can pass on to others, namely, don't go the direction of the adulterous house. Don't go there because that's going to be deadly. Choose a different path. Choose someone else to follow. And that someone else in the sequence of wisdom poems will be the next chapter, chapter 8. Choose instead woman wisdom as the one that you keep company with. You receive her hospitality, you submit yourself to her instruction, and as a result, become a wise and prosperous person. So, observation. Another one might be found in chapter 6, where the sage says to the lazy young person, "Go to the ant and take note. There's a little insect which is very industrious, and consequently, in the seasons when food is not available, it has plenty. Go and observe." Yet another occurs in chapter 24. "I went past the field of the slugger. I applied my heart to what I observed." So he reflects on what he sees, and what he finds there is that weeds grow up, even though the field is productive. Now, there are only weeds because the sluggard, the lazy person, has not exerted the necessary effort to develop a good crop. Lesson learned, be industrious, and then good things follow. The next concept we want to focus on is order. Wisdom is the observation of order. What the sage realized as he looked at the created world and universe around him was that it was an orderly place. In simple terms, a predictable effect would follow an observed cause. The universe is a rational cause-effect environment. Here's just one sample. You'll recognize the concept behind it, an exhortation to diligence, similar to verses we've seen before, but at this point, take note of the fact that there is a cause leading to a predictable effect. A person who works his land, that's the cause, will be satisfied with food, the predictable effect. So once again, as the sage looked around in his universe, he observed, much as a scientist, that certain causes would produce predictable results, predictable effects. This indicated to him that there was an orderliness in the universe, and that allows one to make predictions. Consequently, it allows one to make choices. Without this, if the universe was strictly random, wisdom would not be possible. We've said that the sage engages in observation of various realms, 3 of them actually. The first is the natural realm. Here's an observation arising from the natural realm, chapter 25. "As wind without rain, so is a man who promises a gift but does not produce it." The sage observed that typically, in his environment, there were winds which could produce rain. Presumably, these would be winds coming off the Mediterranean. That would be wind with rain. But if it's wind coming from the east, blowing towards the Mediterranean, that's coming across the Saudi Arabian desert, and that is a wind without rain. And he says, just as there are certain winds that bring no rain at all, that is like a person who says one thing, but doesn't follow through. He promises a gift, but doesn't produce it. The sage is able to build this analogy because he makes observation about the natural realm. A moment ago, we referred to the imperative, go to the ant and watch what goes on in the natural realm, and then learn, in this case, learn to be industrious. The second realm in which we see the sage offering observation has to do with the realm of human interaction, the social realm. And so we find this exhortation: do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among great men. An observation that if one engages in self-exaltation in the king's court, things will not go well. Incidentally, we find a number of the sayings within Proverbs make sense or give advice within a court, within a palace, within a monarchy setting. These kinds of sayings, some of them at least, were intended to advise courtiers on how to behave. Not only natural realm, not only social realm, but also the divine realm. The sage makes observations and offers advice. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but victory rests with the Lord. The sage is aware that the Lord can overturn a seemingly foolproof plan for success if the Lord has other ideas in mind. So he's aware, he's observed how God operates, and he factors that into his overall formula for successful living. Chapter 22 warns that if someone takes advantage and exploits the poor, he will find himself up against nothing less than divine retribution. God is at work in this world. Next, let's consider the topic rational choice. As we've suggested, wisdom is the observation of order in the material, social, and divine realms, so as to discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. The ability of the individual to make a choice is fundamental to the understanding, the assumption, the outlook of the sage. Consider, for example, this instruction from chapter 1. My son, do not walk in their way. Now, in context, the sage, as the father figure, has been cautioning, inoculating his son against the temptation of thugs who say in the verses prior to this, come join our gang. We will use homicidal techniques in order to steal wealth. And so the father jumps in and says, don't go that route. An instruction of this sort would have no value whatsoever if the son was powerless to choose. So the sage assumes that people can choose a course of action. Wisdom, then, is observing order in these various realms so as to discern by rational choice which way to go. Here is another sort of choice that the sage assumes a person can make. If your enemy is hungry, make him eat some food. Make it possible. This shouldn't be understood as forcing them, but bring it about. Facilitate so that your enemy, his hunger will be met. Implicit behind this instruction is the assumption that the audience, whoever is listening to this, ourselves in this case, has the power to choose to bring some food to an enemy who is hungry. Rational choice is a power that the sage assumes the audience can engage in, choosing the right path. And the last concept in this definition is found in the phrase leading to happiness. At this point, we need to do a bit of a word study in this idea that's translated here, happiness. The Hebrew word is asher, or more typically, ashrei. Ashrei represents, in the Hebrew philosophical mindset, the ultimate good. Unfortunately, our word happy in English does a poor job of representing what a profound value this was in the Hebrew way of thinking. You may be familiar with the Latin expression, the summum bonum, the absolute ultimate good. That is the concept behind this word ashrei. So when we read the phrase, happy are those who find wisdom, it doesn't mean simply that they have a little smile on their face. It means here are the people who, in the sage's estimation, have really arrived. These are the people who have laid hold of one thing in life which has value, which brings benefit above everything else. It is this, discovering wisdom. The sage is interested in showing people how to make these rational choices. For what reason? So that they will live a life that is of maximum worth, of maximum satisfaction in enduring ways, not fleeting happiness, not just a good emotion for a brief period of time, but a life that in the long haul is wonderfully worth living. Here's another verse where we find this same word employed, happy, with the underlying Hebrew ashrei. This time, however, it's not classifying wisdom finders as people who have laid hold of the ultimate good. Here we see that other sorts of behaviors are also classified by the sage as leading to the unfolding of an ultimately worthwhile life. Happy are those who are kind to the poor. In chapter 14, verse 21, the last half of this verse. When we find the sage making these kind of value statements, we should slow down our reading and consider carefully what is being expressed. Once again, the sage, as we translate this word happy, is not referring to some fleeting emotion of momentary enjoyment. Rather, he's making a profound statement about what he has discovered to be true and worthwhile. And typically, he is identifying a behavior which many people to whom he's speaking would not have thought it so consequential in the quest for a worthwhile life. Here's the behavior, being kind to the poor. Many people, evidently in his audience, and would it not also be true in ours, would look at this behavior, kindness to the poor, and say, well, it's nice to be sympathetic, it's nice to reach out, it's nice to share what we have. The sage says, oh, it's much more than that. If we will opt for this course of action, kindness to the poor, here's what you get, here's what I get as the benefactor, the one providing this kindness. We discover that we have just, in a sense, blundered into the life that's most worth living for ourselves. This is what the sage wants to impart to the person he's teaching. He wants them to discover this kind of life that he's discovered, and a life that they might not know about unless the sage came along and said, this is what really brings enduring happiness of the most profound and worthwhile sort. Would you like to see one more example? Notice this from chapter 16. Happy are those who trust in the Lord. Now please bring some of the earlier suggestions that we've offered in this lecture about the weightiness of this notion of happy. And then place that alongside, put that in the backdrop of this invitation to be one who relies on the covenant-making, the covenant-keeping God of Israel, the Adonai of Israel, relying in this supernatural being. That is what renders a life truly, truly happy. And so, to refresh our memory, here once again is the definition of wisdom that's being offered here in whole. Wisdom, the observation of order or orderliness in three realms, whether it be material, social, or divine. And then having observed that orderliness, it enables us to discern by rational choice, for we have the power to choose, says the sage. And what must we choose? What will we want to be able to choose? The path, the direction that will most effectively lead to the life ultimately worth living. which for convenience sake we will label happiness. As commented earlier, it's not enough to present truth to someone. Sometimes the truth itself will not be sufficient motivation. How then did the sage help to move the student to act on the truth that was presented to him or her? One element is challenging the student. Go see for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. And we see that in the exhortation, go to the ant and think about it. Perhaps you're familiar with the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. In this particular sequence, it begins with the statement, in the short term, it would make me happy to go play outside. And then on further reflection, in the longer term, it would make me happier to do well at school and become successful. And we see the final decision, but in the very long term, I know which will make better memories. So as we come to the question again of how the sage motivated, he motivated by exposing the consequences of choices, that is to say, what will be the long-term results. Calvin and Hobbes, what will make for the long-term memories. And so, for better or ill, that's the choice that is made. The sage used the same technique. What will be the long-term benefit or the long-term cost, the long-term harm? Look at the end of the road and see if that is really the destination where you wish to arrive. There is a particular word in Hebrew called acharit, which recurs with sufficient frequency to convince us that the sage was very much interested in pointing out the destination of a given choice. One of the places you can find that is in chapter 16, verse 25. Here you see at the top that particular passage. Sometimes there is a way that seems to be right, but in the end, and here is our word acharit, but in the end, it is the way to death. The sage is very interested that we would be able to penetrate with our vision, looking past the immediate appeal of one choice or another, and be able to, as if we had X-ray vision, determine what will be the outcome of this choice. Sometimes it will lead to positive consequences. In chapter 3, verses 13 and following, the outcome of finding wisdom brings some very valuable benefits, and consequently, this sage motivates the student to move in that direction, pursue wisdom. Happy are those who find wisdom and those who get understanding, for her income, and here are the benefits, better than silver, better than gold, more precious than jewels. Verse 16, benefits, yes, long life, riches and honor, paths of pleasantness. And 18, she is a veritable tree of life to those who lay hold of her. So at times we find the sage using positive consequences to motivate. He will also use negative consequences. And there are a variety of passages here that you may consult to see that. The consequence of following the adulteress. And related to that, again, mortal consequences if one decides to take on Dame Folly in chapter 9 as your hostess, as the one that you visit, as the one whom you regard as a source of direction and truth. We've already looked at 1625, the way that seems right, and incidentally that occurred earlier in 1412. If someone chases after profit or gain, but the avenue to arrive at that gain is not ethical, it's wrongful gain, this will lead to a bad end. Alcoholic beverage is cautioned against in 23 because of the consequence of the hangover and actually self-damage that's described there. And now we come to the matter of illustration. As the sage was presenting truth and seeking to motivate his petty, the naive, the youth, to act on this truth, how then did he illustrate? And we'd have to conclude that the sage called attention to his own pattern of embracing wisdom, his own pattern of listening and being receptive, and then pursuing choices which would lead to valuable destinations. Watch me, watch my life, and live as I do. He modeled teachability, this receptivity. And we find this actually chronicled in a bit of an autobiographical report in chapter 4. It's as if he looks at his immediate audience, his class, and says, you know, there was a time when I was where you are. I used to be a boy. And I had someone who was trying to guide me, my father, just as I, like a father, am teaching you. And he told me, lay hold of my words. That is, it's a simple expression, but it has great, great meaning. Be receptive to what I'm teaching you. Don't brush it off. Don't say later. This is the time to be receptive. And then we find that that is, in fact, what the sage must have done, for he's become a wise person. Besides being receptive, the sage models a very key trait, which is humility and reverence before God and mysteries of a sort that he cannot fathom. So in chapter 30, we find a sage, and this happens to be credited to Agur, not to Solomon, but to a different sage, Agur. It's thought that this person may have been a non-Israelite, but someone who is very much supportive of the theology of Israel. And so we find him acknowledging, I am the most ignorant of men. Think of it. This is someone in his day with a graduate degree from Harvard or MIT, as it were, saying, you know, I really don't know anything. And then he presses on and tells us what he doesn't grasp. I don't have knowledge of the Holy One. And in that same chapter, 3 things too amazing for me, 4 I don't understand. And then he presents some riddles. So we find the sage not claiming to have arrived, but modeling humility. In this study, we've seen what it was that fueled the sage's activities, primarily a desire to intercept the malleable youth before someone of evil character got their hands on him. Before that point, he wanted, as it were, to inoculate them against the seduction of anything less than a moral life with reverence of God that would lead to a truly successful conclusion. We've seen also the kind of students that the sage engaged. Students which would be open to teaching. The content we've seen of the teaching was observing order and then enabling choice for a happy outcome. It's the life that is ultimately fortunate, ultimately enviable in its durable goodness. The motivation we've seen had to do with showing what will be the outcome, where will a given choice lead, and that was one of the ways of motivating. The primary illustration, the sage's own life as a learner and as one marked by humility, for reverence for God is the foundation stone of all wisdom.